Adam, man, thanks so much for coming back on the show here today. It's great to have you back on. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Man, great to be back, Mike. Great to catch up again. Let's catch up on life. I mean, like we were just talking about it, this is the first time in my career that I'm not affiliated with a pro sports team, 15 long years in sports. So that in itself is liberating and just a different pace of life and different chapters. So that's wonderful in pursuing the entrepreneur side of things. And so really from just a life perspective, life slowed down, taking on new projects, NBA offseason just finished up, launched a performance therapy mentorship, got a couple cool projects in the works with some concierge med docs out here in Scottsdale, dipping my toe into the digital fitness space with a partnership with iFit and the legendary John Peel over there.
Nice.
And then, upcoming winter, Scottsdale is a hub for athletes in the wintertime. So providing rehab and performance therapy and training for all the athletes that are coming out here. So certainly not short of opportunity and at the same time enjoying the non-travel and being home for dinner.
Yeah, I love it, man. Yeah. And if you are not watching, man, it's very rare that I see a guest that has a better backdrop than I do. But this guy's podcast game is so elite right now. He's got like the fancy mic in the background. Dude, you're killing it over there.
Man, I had to just step right in and only do the best, right?
That's right.
I got tired of the headphones and I was like, I'm just going to invest in having a decent mic and a decent setup, and it makes a world of difference, honestly.
It makes a huge difference, dude. It sounds like we're in the same room. It's so buttery sound. So, okay, man. So we kind of talked about like what's new. I would just love to just dive in with you because we were talking about this before the show, and just to give some context, I think as a strength and conditioning coach, when I hear the term return to play, I immediately think about what my role is, right? Like when I take the baton from a physical therapist, so if somebody's coming off an ACL or a hamstring strain, something like that, I think about, okay, they're back in the gym and they're working with me. But I would love to back that up even further because I think a lot of strength coaches don't have any context into the medical side, right? They don't know what an orthopedic doctor or a surgeon or a physical therapist such as yourself is thinking. So let's start really simple, right? Somebody has a major injury. What's the first thing or the first steps that go through your mind as a physical therapist?
Yeah, I love this question. And you're right. There's very few people that have the opportunity to really experience it from ground zero, from hour zero all the way to the final hour where they're back making their return onto the court, the field, whatever it may be. So to provide some context to this, right, having worked in pro sports, part of my role towards the end of my career was when an athlete went down during a game, after the head athletic trainer evaluated the situation on the court or on the field, and the decision was made, hey, we're going to go in the back locker room or get off the field and go for further evaluation. I would accompany the player into the back room, and alongside an orthopedic physician and usually some sort of radiologist, we would evaluate the athlete holistically. So the first thing that comes to mind from the moment, let's just say that contact happened. Let's use basketball and let's use an ankle sprain. I think that's a pretty simple one that we can talk through from an acute phase, right? First thing you're worried about is safety and medical red flags. Like first and foremost, safety and medical red flags. So what might that look like? You're worried about, hey, are there any compound fractures? Are they able to bear weight? Are they able to get up and walk on their own, or do they need help, right? All these medical red flags that would warrant, like, forget Adam. Like, let's go to the hospital. Let's just make sure we're not going to lose a limb here. And like just to provide some context, right? Some ones that have been in the NBA, you can think about the Gordon Hayward injury several years ago. You can think about Paul George's a while back. You could think about Alex Smith in the NFL. So those are the ones where you say, okay, safety and emergencies, like that's most important. So this is the first step that goes into my mind. Now let's say, okay, that's not the case. It's an ankle sprain, comes in the back. Orthopedic physician and myself complement our evaluations, but slightly different. They're looking at it more from a structural integrity perspective, and there'll be some crossover with our examinations. But because, truthfully, having worked in sports versus you have a physician that's working in a clinic that just sees countless patients over their career, trust that evaluation to say, okay, just evaluate the structural integrity. And if you're talking about an ankle sprain, you're looking at all the ligaments, the joints, the bones. Typically, you're going to get an x-ray just to rule out any fracture that you can't feel, you can't tease out. Athletes got the adrenaline going, and their symptoms are kind of clouded. So you get the XR just to make sure, okay, we don't have an acute fracture. From there, then my responsibility is, okay, I'm looking at it more from a functional perspective and knowing what the athlete has to be able to do on the court. Are you going to be able to demonstrate these things? So things that are slightly different than what a physician might do, rather than worrying about structural integrity, I'm more concerned about, hey, do we have the requisite range of motion? Do we have the strength we need to do? Can we get you on your feet and you feel comfortable and safe moving around? What does that look like? Just the reality is you're in the tunnel. You're going through this false sense of sprinting, jumping, and change of direction. You're doing it the best you can. And soccer, you have a little bit more space on the sidelines to do those things. But my role there is then, okay, now I'm looking at it from a space of, do you have the ability to go out and play and do the things you do without having to think about this? And the one thing that's important to highlight here is this: at this moment in time, when there's no medical red flags, structural integrity isn't compromised, and we're just dealing with some acute symptoms because there was some collision, a contact injury, whatever it may be. You're dealing more with a cognitive aspect more than anything. And context matters here. So if it's the 10th game of the NBA season and it's the second quarter, we may not be going back out there. We may just chalk this one up and say, hey, we're just going to pull back 10 game of the season. We've got 72 more to go plus playoffs. Why rush this? If it's playoffs and it's third quarter and your team's down by 4, 7-game series, it's game 5, slightly different context. So that's why I say from a cognitive perspective, those things matter. And as a practitioner, I had to be willing to trust the player once we ruled out all those things and make sure, hey, this is the gray space where we could go out and give this a go, get the athletic trainer back in. Can we provide any taping or bracing? And then if not, okay, what are we going to do the next day to continue this evaluation? So I'll hit pause there. And do you want to keep going, or where do you want to take it?
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. And it just gives, like you said, it gives some context as to like those first 48 hours, because again, many of us have not been in those environments or those situations, right? And maybe you were, but as an athlete, right? Like I remember rolling my ankle or bruising my heel or all the random injuries that I had growing up. But I don't think we think about it now as a strength coach, because we're just thinking about, oh, they're back in the gym. Are they ready to lift? Are they ready to sprint, jump, cut, all of those things? And I don't think a lot of times we think that far back in the process.
Yeah. And in the pro sports space, like that happens all in a matter, like everything I just described is a matter of 10 minutes. Like it's fast. And then if we decide, even regardless if they go back into the game or not, right? Chances are the next day, because athletes are your biggest asset, they're a massive investment, and you're going to go and you're going to follow through with more diagnostics. So if we stick with the ankle sprain, the very next day we're coordinating MRI. If we have any questions about the imaging results, maybe we're going to get a second opinion, and or the player's agent is requesting a second opinion from a doc they trust. So then we're trying to coordinate second party docs. We're speaking with a radiology specialist, and then internally we're starting to aggregate our own diagnosis, and then ultimately collectively with all the key stakeholders, a diagnosis is created, and that's within 24 hours. And then within the next 24 hours, this is where you start to plan, okay, what does this look like? What does timeline look like? What's reasonable? What's unreasonable? Where are we at in the season? Where's this player at in their contract year? If they are a contract year, where's the team's investment into this athlete? Is this a 15-man on the roster, or is this your starting point guard that just signed a $200 million contract, right? All these things start to come into play as far as how you approach the plan of care. And I hate to say all those things like are influencing. If I was like on the outside looking, it's like, well, it shouldn't matter about all those things, right? Like the athlete, ankle sprain's an ankle sprain, like just treat that. But unfortunately, team sports is not just about that. Like professional sports is the cross section of entertainment, business, and then athletics. Like you're not getting paid unless you play games. You're not playing games unless there's media deals, and you're not getting media deals unless there's a business value behind it. So all those things come into play. So that's why it's important to highlight in the pro sports setting, and you're probably even seeing it in the college setting, I would imagine, with the NIL influence as well. So all those things start to come into play. Even like when the athletes are starting to have active voices in their plan of care. That's not this state where athletes are unaware of what's going on. They've got multiple people on their support teams. A lot of pro athletes, and even I'm seeing NIL athletes, have their own external support. So you have all these cooks in the kitchen. So the hardest thing in those first 48 hours is getting all the information, aggregating it, ciphering through it, figuring out what's meaningful, what's not meaningful, and then everybody coming together saying, okay, this diagnosis and this is the plan.
Yeah. Okay. That's fantastic. Now, I would love to hear, and again, we'll speak in generalities. I want to talk about some specific cases later on, but I'd love to talk in generalities. So, you've kind of aggregated all this data and all this information, right? And you've laid out a plan. I would love to hear, do you have like specific phases, right? So like in training, right? Maybe you have a hypertrophy block and a strength block and a power block, whatever you want to think of. Do you have phases like that you're taking somebody through to get them from that initial injury back to a point where we would start to transition, where you would maybe pass that person off more to me?
Yes, I would label where that transition usually happens, or that passing a baton. If you're talking about strictly like medical silo and performance silo, typically that's where, like, right, the crossroad of that is like the return to training phase, right? There's return to training, there's return to performance, and then there's return to play. People love to say different buzzwords around all of it. To me, it all rolls together because it's the same process. You're just at different stages of it. So in order to get to the return to training phase, where I feel as a physical therapist comfortable letting the reins off and passing it off without feeling, okay, we're in a gray space, I'm not sure if you can tolerate that, right? The check marks that we're looking at early on, right? The first and foremost thing as a physical therapist, what you're trying to do, or as a medical provider, athletic trainer, sports chiropractor, whatever that role is, you're trying to restore homeostasis to the localized tissue, first and foremost, right? And what restore homeostasis often means in an acute injury is managing inflammation, not getting rid of it, managing inflammation. And we can double click on that later. Managing inflammation, trying to reduce pain, and then you're trying to restore functional range of motion. And I say functional because most athletes don't have the relative or optimal range of motion. So just getting them back to what their baseline is, or what is minimum viable product in order to start participating in return to training. So as far as managing inflammation, the two biggest things that are going to help manage inflammation are compression and movement. The ways you manage pain, pain medication helps, but also that's where ice comes into play. That's where also compression can help with pain, stim units, all the modalities that you can think of that are manipulating kind of any of the pressure receptors, heat receptors, proprioception. All those things are just creating noise to block the pain signal, quote unquote pain signal, the nociception, to then allow the pain to reduce. And then you're trying to restore functional range of motion. Well, the reality is you're not going to even be able to get to restoring functional range of motion until you get rid of pain and swelling. In an acute injury, the first and foremost thing you're trying to do, especially if we stick with this ankle topic, if you don't get rid of swelling, everything else is an uphill battle. That's why, like, those first 48 to 96 hours, those first 2 to 5 days, like, it's just hammering home, doing everything you can to get rid of swelling and get pain down, because once you do that, everything else just goes so much smoother. If you try to rush that bit, if you try to go too fast too soon, it's a little bit of pain, it's a little bit of swelling. Like, there's a reason why there's pain and there's a reason why there's swelling. Okay, the swelling is the natural healing response. Like, there's a reason why it's survived evolution. Like, we need swelling and inflammation. Like, that is a good thing that happens. It's the natural way for healing to occur. Right. The problem with swelling is when it lingers. Okay. When it lingers, when you have increased pressure in that area, that's going to change range of motion output. That's going to change the ability to access range of motion. That's going to impact motor output. That's going to impact sensory input. It's going to impact movement. Right. So if you have that swelling that's lingering, that's why it gets a bad rap when it lingers, or chronic swelling. We can leave that one off the table for now. But that's why swelling and inflammation gets a bad rap. But in actuality, that's the first part of the healing process. So we just want to manage it appropriately to then allow the natural response of the system to do its job.
Yeah, dude, I love that. It's funny, or maybe just interesting, because I've worked in all these different diverse environments, right? And I've gotten to work with people that are fresh off knee replacements, ACLs, Achilles. Like, I've seen all these different things that I think a lot of strength coaches haven't. And one of the things that I've consistently seen when people are not having success, they're jumping into mobility activities and motor control. They're like, oh, my knee motion isn't back, or, my quad, why is my quad so weak? And then you look at their knee and it looks like a grapefruit, and I'm trying to explain to them, it's like, you're skipping steps here, my friend, right? Like, until you have the swelling under control, you're not going to be able to move that joint through anywhere near a full range of motion. You're not going to get those muscles to fire and activate because you haven't set the stage. And I think it's so great you point that out, because I think a lot of times people want to get right into this stuff, right? And they hear, oh yeah, you got to start, get moving immediately and start training immediately. And it's like, yeah, but there's steps and there's criteria you have to pass if you want to get into that.
Nothing's more humbling than a post-op rehab.
Yeah.
And like you want like that's the like we talk about the extremes, kind of tell the limitations, tell the story. Well, the extremes of an injury is a reconstructive surgery, whether that's an ankle reconstructive surgery, ACL reconstructive surgery, an arthroplasty, whatever it may be, right? Watch any of those surgeries on YouTube and you'll see the quote unquote the damage that's done to the tissue to make it viable again.
Yes.
And so I didn't have that appreciation, right? Earlier in my career, I was fitness, sports science, performance. Man, like I fell in that bucket. It's like, man, it's just a little bit of swelling. Like, we'll be all right. We'll be able to get to it. I didn't have an appreciation for it until I lived it as a physical therapist and lived it on the medical model, right?
Yeah.
And so at fault to no performance coach or strength and conditioning coach that has that mentality. Like, honestly, I'd rather you have that mentality as a physical therapist that has to manage the medical model. I'd rather tell the strength and conditioning coach, pull back the reins rather than me having to encourage you to do more, because a problem that exists in the industry of physical therapy based on the education system, we struggle with exercise progression and loading, right? Unless you seek that out. And that's why the collaboration with the strength and conditioning coach is so important once we get to that return to training phase. But I would summarize it and say, be willing to pull back the reins to allow the acute swelling, the acute management phase to proceed. Because if you don't, you're just delaying the time that you're actually going to be able to do the things that you want to do as a strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah.
It's like the analogy I would use when teaching this to young practitioners, even with colleagues at times, like there's a bank, right? You have $100 in the bank. The athlete can only invest $100 into whatever the highest priorities are. If we're stealing resources, if we're stealing $20, $30, $40 to go do some strength and conditioning, which is meaningful and valuable, and we can talk about where that place is, but in those first few days, like $100 needs to go towards getting rid of that managing the swelling and managing the acute injury. So then I don't have to get paid anymore. And now, Mike, you can go get paid and take $100. If not, you're just going to delay when you actually get your payday, and nobody wants that, right?
Yeah. Well, and look, honestly, the worst part to that is not only are you delaying the entire process, but you're making them feel worse. Like when somebody's knee is swollen or ankle, whatever, look, all you have to do is go have one of these injuries yourself, right? Like, dude, my ankles are so busted from years of basketball and volleyball. I joke around, they're like paper mache. But, like, dude, it doesn't feel good when you're trying to get around and like fight through stuff. Like, it's not valuable. So like giving the body time to kind of heal and, like you said, deal with and manage some of that swelling and inflammation so that then down the line you can do those things, I think is valuable. So following up on this, again, I'm going to show my age here, but I came up in an age where it was very movement focused, right? If you're not squatting, hinging, lunging, it's not valuable. And luckily, I think we've kind of come full circle on this, and we've started to appreciate the role of building muscles when we're trying to rehab somebody from an injury. So could you talk to that a little bit about like isolated, targeted tissue strengthening when somebody's coming off an injury to then building muscles, right, early on in an acute phase to then reintegrate that back into movements later on?
You can look at that from two different ways. You can look at it from structural integrity, and you can also look at it from motor learning. Okay, so you can look at it from the motor learning perspective and like considering part task versus whole task strategies. So when you talk about squatting, right, like think about like the FMS, like everyone who grew up in the early 2000s and Gray Cook popularized the FMS and SFMA, right? Like the whole mobility stability debate, like, oh, this based on your FMS score, you need more stability, you need more mobility, and then based on your score, you would regress to this developmental position, whether it was rolling, half kneeling, quadruped, right? All these progressions. The same principle of regressions based on part task strategies, local joint activities, isolated exercises to then integrate that back into the whole movement. Because the thing you have to remember with an injury is structural integrity was compromised at some level. And then with that, you're balancing the experience with pain, which everybody's experienced with pain, the emotional response to that, the physical response to that. Everyone has a unique pathway with that. And so by integrating some of these localized tissue qualities, these localized exercises, what you're doing is you're teaching the body it's okay to load this tissue again. And if you try, I'll put my hand up and say, I've done this. I've had a post-op knee before where I've tried to build strength through global movement patterns. And then we realized this just isn't working. We have to go in locally and just focus on part tasks, single joint exercises. Although like you know me, Mike, I love movement. I love systems thinking. Like I want to get that. But when you have this injury, sometimes the body, you have to override that, or you have to teach the body, hey, it's okay to load this again. It's okay to move this again. Sometimes I have to use my hands and I have to show them. That's what passive range of motion is. That's what active assisted range of motion is. I'm helping you ride the bike by putting the training wheels on. Ultimately, I want to take those training wheels off, or I don't want to have to show you how to ride the bike, and you go and ride the bike and do the exercise yourself. But sometimes we need those exercises to give confidence to the athlete, put local stress into the tissue, and then be able to build that part back up to an adequate level where that will not be a weak link. So from a motor learning perspective, or like a cognitive, if you want to even call it a neural perspective, that's important there. That's how to tie that. From a true, like you were talking about, hypertrophy phase, like let's use the classic example of an ACL and a quad. Like their quad atrophy happens fast.
Yeah.
And so
crazy.
You're not going to be able to run, jump, and change direction effectively if your quadricep is not at an adequate level of strength, period. Like hard stop. If you're not achieving 100% body weight, peak torque on an isokinetic test, and you're not achieving 120% of that on eccentric qualities, your quality of running, your quality of jumping, and your force plate metrics, you're going to see something. So skipping those steps just to get back to functional movement, just to get back to running, jumping, change of direction because a surgeon said you can start running at 3 months, but your asymmetry and isokinetic is 50%. It's like, whoa. There's almost like this false sense of, I'm going to be great at my job if I can get you back running and jumping faster. But the reality is, like, don't skip the steps of improving the quality of the parts before you start chasing the qualities of the whole.
Yeah, I love it, man. So one thing I'm interested in, because, we talked about mobility, we've talked about like isolated muscle strength. Do you feel like there's a middle ground in there that is more just focused on pure like motor control? Because I know some people really like hang their hat on this, and there's all kinds of wizardry and tech out there now that chases, can you activate quad at 80%? Like, do you think there's a role for that? Or is it a little bit more clearly defined? Like, hey, once we've got swelling and inflammation managed, we're into mobility. Once we have that, now we can start strengthening. Do you feel like there's a middle ground for motor control work or no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like if we stick with the analogy of riding a bike, like I think that's the training wheels. And I think what you'll find is I wouldn't necessarily label it as motor control. It's like it's graded exposure, right? Because if you're doing if you're doing motor control activities, chances are your load is pretty low and your speed of movement is pretty low.
Yep.
So what are you doing? It's graded exposure to movement. Now, whatever philosophy you subscribe to, whether that's DNS, PRI, UHPC, like any of these, right?
Yep.
They're all targeting at, I am trying to improve the quality of movement through this particular thought process. All of them are successful. All of them work. All of them don't do heavy loads. All of them don't do fast training early on, right? It's all about how can I expose you to these movements by maybe putting certain constraints on the movement to get the output that I want from a movement quality perspective. So in my eyes, if we're talking from a rehab perspective, that middle ground of motor control, I would say like that's that, like you're talking about criteria from like, hey, when are we passing the baton?
Yep.
To me, like I, as a physical therapist, I want to have some exposures with the athlete first to just fine tune like, hey, is this tissue ready to tolerate this? And then feel confident. Okay, yeah, go to S&C, like start working on some motor control, start working on some mobility and movement. Like the tissue's ready to handle that stress. And the only way I'm going to know that we're ready is one, I know that we've managed the local tissue qualities, to piggyback off an earlier question, but then also I'm exposing you to those movements, because ultimately what the whole rehab process is exposure to stress. Like that's what it is. And so if we can appreciate that and understand where these different labels come into, whether it's open kinetic chain, closed kinetic chain, motor control, mobility, stability, all of them have some sort of volume and intensity of stress to that. Where in the continuum does that fit?
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so I want to come back because you mentioned something about timelines. And man, I joke around loosely that I think one of the worst things that ever happened to ACL rehabs was Adrian Peterson. You remember Adrian Peterson?
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing was wild, right? Like, I think it was James Andrews did his surgery. talks about how pristine his knee is. He's like, I've never seen an NFL knee that looks like this. Finishes rehab in 9 months, comes back, leads the league in rushing the next year. Now everybody thinks they're Adrian Peterson and they can do an ACL rehab in 9 months. So the question here is this. When we're talking about coming back from an injury, why should we be more focused maybe on the outcome versus a strict timeline?
It's a double-edged sword. First and foremost, respect biology.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So, for example, like a grade 3 ankle sprain is going to take 6 to 12 weeks. Like, that's just biology. I don't care how much infrared light you throw at it, how many modalities, how many exosomes, peptides you're putting in there. Like, we know that ankle sprains, a grade 3, are going to take 6 to 12 weeks. You know that an ACL tear, just from a healing of the surgery, is going to have to take 3 to 6 months just to mature, and full maturation doesn't happen until 2 years. Not saying that you can't go out and participate, but this is where we have to respect biology. And listen, we're all human beings and species, and unfortunately, our biology hasn't gone as fast as healing as we would like it to be. So I have to acknowledge that from a medical model, you have to respect biological timelines. Now, that's where the gray space is, right? Like you say, hey, Adrian Peterson was back at 9 months. Okay, that's like that's the outlier. Think of a bell curve. Every injury has a bell curve, right? Yeah. 66% of people are going to fall within some of these timelines that I just alluded to, but you're going to have your outliers. I've had people recover from an injury faster than I expected, and then vice versa. I mean, I've had an athlete take 5.5 weeks to recover from a quad contusion, which is unheard of, but it happened, right? So there's always those outliers. So Adrian Peterson is that outlier. So when you talk about process and you talk about the outcomes like you alluded to, once you kind of clear the biology side of things, which organically happens if your process is detailed and progressive, then you're really talking about the criteria you're using, the stress that you're exposing them to, that you know that they're going to have to be prepared to handle. So like, I think that's like, if there was one thing you could pull back from all the work Tim Gabbett did with acute chronic, is like the question you have to ask yourself with anybody, in particular with rehab, is this athlete prepared to handle the stress that I'm about to expose to them? And so the outcomes of all these tests and measures, you're just trying to evaluate that from an intensity perspective, and then you're stacking volume on top of that. And then if they're an athlete playing at a high level, then you're just you're stacking on small-sided games and progressive loading on field, on court, in the context of the sport.
Yep, I love it, man. So talk to me about the role a strength and conditioning coach can play. Right. And so I've got a couple thoughts here and a couple analogies that may work, but like in your environment, right? Somebody comes off an ACL injury. So now they're seeing you and they're doing their acute phase rehab. What could my role be as an S&C coach? Maybe not dealing with the lower half, but dealing with the upper half. And it reminds me of Eric Cressy used to have this quote. I think this happened very early on in his career. Do you know what I'm going to say about this? But Eric, same deal. Somebody comes in and they're like, oh, they're on crutches. Oh, I just had my ACL done. I'll see you in a couple months. And Eric's like, what are you talking about, bro? You have 2 healthy arms, a healthy leg, a core. We're training ASAP. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how an S&C coach can still help develop or grow an athlete, even while they're maybe going through some acute phase rehab.
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind. I think when you talk about like that acute phase where we're really trying to manage the medical side, like be that support system for them, right? There's going to be a lot of conversations and a lot of thoughts of like what I can't do, what I can't do, what I can't do. Just be that support system and start highlighting, no, these are all the things you'll be able to do and that you can do. Now, that doesn't mean you go out and do all of them, because remember, the priority is to manage that acute phase, and typically you need medical management for that, or physical therapy, or just those professions to help manage that. That being said, treat the diagnosis, but also treat the system. Mm-hmm. So managing the system, if we look into residual training effects, right? What do we know about residual training effects? Speed and alactic power are probably dropping in the first 5 to 7 days. Okay, cool. As a strength and conditioning coach, start thinking like that. Okay, day 5, this athlete hasn't done anything besides lying on the table, getting soft tissue work, and having modalities hooked up. Okay, cool. Like, I know if I just give them a small dose here at day 5, say they have an ankle sprain, say they have post-op ACL, right? I know if I can get them to do some seated med ball throws, we're stressing the system from a speed and power perspective. Cool. Hit that every 5 days. Okay, next thing from a residual training effect. Okay, what about glycolytic power and anaerobic system? Okay, we're probably talking 10 to 14 days. That starts to drop off. Okay, cool. Can you come up with a circuit or a conditioning program that stresses that system without compromising the tissue of the injury. Okay. Second thing you could do. Third thing you could do is from an overall conditioning perspective. Okay. Aerobic conditioning has the longest rate of decay, has the longest residual training effect. If you think about it, aerobic capacity, aerobic conditioning, those are usually structural adaptations. The anaerobic glycolytic is kind of the in-between of structural and enzymatic. And then the alactic and speed is more the neural drive. So each one of those, if you think about it, you can delay the time just based on what it is from a physiological perspective. So the strength and conditioning perspective, one, consider what those the residual training effects are, and then program how you can provide that stress to the system to be able to mitigate any deconditioning. Full stop, deconditioning is going to happen. It just is, especially if if it's less than a 2-week injury, then you're just basically managing symptoms and just trying to get them back out there as soon as possible. The moment you cross that 2-week barrier, in my experience, you're going to have some sort of deconditioning element, and that's where you're trying to mitigate that as much as possible early on. I think the best way you can do that is to think about it from a residual training effect. When you start talking about, like you alluded to, hey, you got an upper body, you got a right arm, a left leg, a left arm as well. You click into the literature around contralateral limb training and how that also stresses the system, but also once that limb that was affected is able to get back into training, you'll actually see potentially minimal drop off, because when you do contralateral limb training, although you're not loading the structure, right? Don't ever forget about the mechanical load that has to go through that limb, and you have to still stress that. But from a neural output perspective, you may not see as much of a deficit of strength and power if you're training contralateral or upper extremities at the same time. So think about it from that perspective too. It's like, oh, I may not have to use this affected side, but how else can I impact this affected side by training the rest of the system? Again, treat the diagnosis, but manage the system. And then the other thing I would recommend is throughout the whole entire process of the rehab case, especially in the acute side of things, even as silly as this sounds, like there would be days where I'd have athletes that were just down in the dumps, and I'd send them into the weight room, like, dude, just go do curls for the girls. Like, go in and just hit a bodybuilding session. Because here's the one thing I think we don't appreciate about athletes is they do a lot of physical activity, and hormonally speaking, they're used to those levels of endorphins in their system, oxytocin in their system. Like, movement gives us all of that. If you're unfamiliar with that, read John Rady's book called Spark, and you'll quickly learn how movement and exercise impacts everything internally. So I think what happens is psychologically athletes lose part of their identity because they're not allowed to do the thing that they love. Okay, they're being fit. It's not their choice. They can't do something they love and enjoy. The second thing that I don't think, I wish I could like have all these lab draws and say, yeah, when they're playing, like these are all their endorphins and hormones. But if we just kind of extrapolate from that perspective and say, okay, why are they in the dumps? Why are they feeling down? Yeah, psychologically they're not playing. And is there something else they're missing in their life that they're used to? Probably is. That's exercise. So just even if it's not related to performance, like there's value in then just having the athlete come in the weight room, do some bodybuilding. Like who doesn't like to do any kind of that activity? You could, even if you go high volume, now you start talking about from a physiological perspective, hey, are you getting some of those endorphins or chemical mediators released? And then you can even argue, hey, if you get those to release and you get those to be part of the system, does that impact healing? Yes. Theoretically, sure, it can. Right. But having them come into the weight room and physically do something restores part of their identity, impacts their physiology in a positive way. And also they're constantly being told what they can't do in rehab. Be that light at the end of the tunnel that says, hey, here's all the things that you can do. And just support them in that with respect to what the medical team or what the rehab team is trying to accomplish at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it really comes back to one of the things I always think of, or one of our primary roles as a strength coach is to just buoy the athlete, right? Like, and I've talked about this with numerous people on the podcast here lately where, I mean, look, athletes are human beings, right? And sometimes more volatile, not necessarily in a bad way. It's just like comes with the territory, right? You're up. Yeah, great practice. Oh, I played awful. You know, they're a little bit more like this all over the place. And so if we can help buoy them and steady them, especially in this case where it's like, hey, man, you're right. A lot of the things that they enjoy has been taken away from them, right? Because it's not just the training. Now they're away from their team, right? They're not at practice. Now they're with the medical team. If you can help buoy them and just kind of be that support system for them, what I've found is that makes for some amazing relationships. I know you can attest to that too, right? Like some of these people that you do have these long-term rehabs with, you have the most amazing relationships with them because you have helped get them through a really dark time in their life. And now they're on the back end and they just see how much time and effort and energy you put into them.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this one case a few years ago, just really tough case, really tough post-op complications. And the dude was just kind of having this yo-yo effect. It was also just a difficult year for him.
Yeah.
And so reflecting back on it, he had told me, he's like, man, like there would be days where I would come in and I would like bring something to you. And I would say, hey, I want to do this today. And you would evaluate and be like, yeah, okay, cool. Let's go do that. And because athletes are scrolling on Instagram, they're talking to people, they're getting their own ideas. And so there was a lot of instances where this athlete would come to me and say, hey, Adam, can I do this today? And don't get me wrong. It's not like he came to me and said like, hey, Adam, can I do this today? And there was sometimes be like, no, like we're not at a place for that. And here's why. And what we can do instead is X, Y, and Z. And so like a friend of mine, Stacey Harden, she reminded me that it's important to say, yes not yes but.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Giving them the power that no, we can't do that, and we can do something else instead. And rather than no, we can't do that, but we'll chalk it up another time. That's incredibly powerful. And so if an athlete brings something to you, and although it may go against your philosophy, although you don't like the way it looks, although you're like, how does this fit into what we're doing? If it's not going to do any harm and the athlete wants to do it, it's like read between the lines. The athlete's not asking you for permit. They're not asking if you like it or not. They're just asking for permission if I can go do something that I believe is going to help me. And there's power in that. And that's okay, especially in those, like you alluded to, those long-term cases where they're with you for a long time. Like you gotta help them out and you got to meet them where they're at and be able to support them with some of their own intentions or ambitions and let them figure it out if it doesn't really fit, because sometimes they'll come to you with a bad idea, but you just need them, almost like your kid. It's like, yeah, go figure it out. Like, you'll probably you'll stumble and fall, but you're not going to hurt yourself.
Yes.
Right? That's okay too.
Yeah, I love it. Considerations for re-injury, right? What are some things we need to be thinking about along the way? So let's say you pass the baton, right? What are some things we need to be thinking about as S&C coaches when we're getting somebody back in the gym, just to make sure that we're putting them in an environment that's going to make them successful and for sure not setting them back?
Having appreciation for where they came from, first and foremost, right?
Okay.
Like you have to understand, what did they just endure? And then if the baton's being passed to you, your job isn't to forget about that and start doing a program that you believe is going to help the athlete. Your job is to literally take that baton, keep running around the bend, and then when you hit the 100-meter sprint, man, take off, like go, like run with it, like you're the only person. But there's still that transition phase where you have to understand where they came from. And I say that with respect to to make that applicable is if they were doing things at the end stage of the end phases of what they were doing with a PT, still incorporate those things. One of my favorite things to do when we get to that return to training phase or any of my phases, what I like to do is whatever we were doing in the previous phase, that now becomes the warm up. And then the new activities are the training session. Then once we get to the next phase, the things that we were just doing in the last block now become the warm-up side. So they're still getting that integration, because it's not just, okay, you've passed this phase all of a sudden and magically your body doesn't need that prior stress or stimulus. Like, no. Like they still need it, just at a lower dose or a lower frequency. So to give some context to this, like a practical example, you said like, hey, a motor control, right? So the way I look at that passing baton phase is really that return to training criteria. Like, what are we as physical therapists and medical practitioners using as tests and measures to say, hey, you're safe to return to training meaning like, yeah, go do GPP, right? So what I would do is, from a physical therapy perspective, I'm going through my checklist of, okay, they got local loading, they've done some basic motor control. Okay, for strength and conditioning coach, how about like we add these motor control activities as part of their warm-up so they get repetitions with it? And then the local loading that I was just doing, they still need some of it. Can we put it at the end of the session, right? Kind of make it the bookends so they're still getting the exposure. And then the transition becomes more seamless. And then what you'll end up doing is now eventually you'll stop doing a lot of the PT side of things, right? Think about money in the bank. You're not going to need that much manual therapy anymore. You're probably not going to need a lot of local loading anymore. What you are going to need is exposure to high velocities, high loads. So now you start shifting your resources towards those, and eventually the things early in rehab phase out, but it shouldn't just be a hard stop, in my opinion. You're still going to need to have that gray space of transition. And so I hope that answers the question as to where you can get to avoid avoiding re-injury and considerations when you get them in there.
Yeah. So the thing that I wrote down, it's so funny you said this, but like kind of just like that domino effect, right? Like what was the workout now becomes the warm up, and just kind of titrating or like building from that. What I literally wrote down here is, if you have somebody that you're going to work with, so let's say you're an S&C coach listening to this, you know you're going to have somebody that's coming off an ACL or a hamstring or whatever, and you don't know what to do with them, right? You've never seen them before. Ask if you can go watch one of their PT sessions, and then literally take that session and make that your first workout, right? And like just kind of like build it up in this way, because what it does is it gives you some appreciation for where they're currently at, right? It gives you some idea as to what movement patterns they own, just the physical qualities that they've developed up to this point, and then it'll help you build things forward. But too often, I think we hear, oh yeah, they're ready to train. And meanwhile, you're having them do body weight squats, right? And you feel comfortable, okay, the tissue's where it needs to be. Yeah, they can go see S&C, and then S&C's like, let's go. And they've got like 225 on the bar with chains. It's like, no, like you have to kind of, like you said, appreciate where they're at, where they're coming from, and then try and make that transition as seamless as possible. So here's what I would love to do if you're game for it. Mm-hmm. I would love to walk our listeners through 2 examples, and I've kind of prepped you for this. But let's start with an ACL, right? And again, what I want to do is give context and give appreciation for where somebody is starting when they're with you, and maybe some of like the big like criteria or the big like rocks along the way, like some big things that they need to check off to get them to a point where you feel like they're ready to train again. So if somebody comes to you, they've just had an ACL, they're in their first day of rehab, walk me through maybe those first, just a couple months. Like, and again, I don't need like an in-depth PT script, but like, what are some things you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think the easiest way for ACL is just to break it up in months. That's the easiest way to go through it. And you can plus or minus 2 weeks in either phase, just given what the concurrent, if there was a meniscus involved, if there was another ligament involved. But the easiest way for ACL is just break it down for months, or 4 weeks of blocks. Wow, tongue twister over here. Blocks of 4 weeks. You and I are both struggling today.
We're struggling today, man. We need more. This is decaf. That's what I'm blaming it on. I need more caffeine.
Oh no, I had my fair share of caffeine already. So yeah, okay. So this happens. Day 1, athlete had surgery yesterday. What are we doing? Okay, goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation. Restore homeostasis, right? My job from an ACL injury, ACL reconstructive surgery, is get a quiet knee as fast as humanly possible, right? And that goes back to what we're talking about, inflammation and swelling, right? I need to manage it. I need to make sure it doesn't get worse, because if I can't manage the inflammation and swelling well in those first 4 weeks, the entire process is going to get delayed. That's why I say plus or minus 2 weeks, right? Respecting that first 4, even sometimes it takes 6 weeks, just depending, like I said, depending on how good your surgeon is, and depending on what else they may have had to done in there. You never know until you get the op note. But those first 4 to 6 weeks, my number one priority is get a quiet knee. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a quiet knee is, that's a blanket statement for saying get swelling down as minimal as possible. There will always be swelling probably in the knee for the first 6 months, right? And we'll talk about why that is. Get swelling as low as possible. Adequately get the range of motion. You're typically getting range of motion by week 4. Again, pending the surgery, you're getting at least to 90. And then between weeks 4 and 8, you're progressing about 10 degrees per week, typically. Okay, and that's all going to be dictated by the surgeon. And then the other component of it is pain, right? You really just got to get rid of pain, because if you have swelling, if you have limitations in range of motion, and you have pain, nothing else matters. Because if you try to do other things, even if it's from a local loading perspective or functional movement perspective or gross motor patterning, the body's going to compensate. The body's smarter than all of us. It's going to find ways to compensate to execute the task. So just take care of that part first. So to summarize, that first 4 weeks is get the quiet knee and restore homeostasis. Now, the second block of 4 weeks, what we're trying to do is start introducing load safely. Now, this is where it is. I'm going to say it here. It is safe to do open kinetic chain exercise on a post-op ACL. We are not going to disrupt the ACL graft as long as you stay within the safe ranges of motion. There's been a lot of research on this, so it's totally safe. even day one, if they can get to the range of motion and they're not in pain and they're in a good space, probably Adrian Peterson was able to do this, right? You talk about a pristine knee, right? As long as that range of motion from an open kinetic chain stays under 60 degrees of knee flexion. So if you're unfamiliar with what that looks like, if you're sitting in a chair, typically your knee is at 90 degrees, okay? Extend your tibia forward where you're kicking your leg out just a little bit, and you're probably getting to about 60 degrees. Staying within that range is going to target quadriceps strength, target quadriceps tendon if they had a patella tendon graft, and it's not going to stress the ACL. Stress the ACL meaning it's not going to produce translation of the tibia in a negative way that would disrupt the graft. That's always the biggest concern with ACL reconstructive. Don't disrupt the graft. So those next 4 to 8 weeks, you're trying to introduce load gradually, primarily through open kinetic chain. And then once they clear from the surgeon that they're able to be full weight bearing and they're able to progress into closed kinetic chain, then you're working from the top down. What we know from ACL stress in an open kinetic chain, the most stress occurs at the smaller range. So from 45 degrees all the way out to a straight leg. The opposite is true from a closed kinetic chain. Okay. If you're at the top of a squat, you'll see a lot of PTs do mini squats, right? With ACLs post-op. Why? Because we know because of closed kinetic chain and the co-contraction that occurs at the knee during that, we are safe to go to a partial range, typically anywhere from 30 to 40 degrees early on, just to train the closed kinetic chain side of things. And then towards the end of the 8 weeks, what I love to do is people that force plates are more and more popular and more readily available. Now you're just trying to get them to squat with equal foot pressure through both force plates. You're trying to make sure that they're not unloading, they're not fear avoidance, right? By the end of the 8 weeks, my goal is to execute a perfect squat within the available range of motion as provided by the surgeon. So that's kind of like the telltale sign of end of block 2. So first 4 weeks, restore homeostasis. Second set, introduce load, just restore normal functional movements of a squat. Then from 8 weeks and beyond, right, if those first 8 weeks go pristine, now you just get into your GPP phase and just progressive overload for the next 4 to 6 months. The way that looks like for me is that next 4 week block, I'm just trying to build up tissue capacity. So from an S&C side, what that looks like, I'm crushing tempos. I'm crushing long duration isometrics up to 60 to 90 seconds. I am really not using a lot of external load because I'm just trying to create time under tension. 2 reasons for that. 1, that's a variable that can induce hypertrophy. 2, it's a good introduction to external load without blowing them up. And 3, when you slow things down and use minimal load, you can really fine tune biomechanics, right? Sometimes athletes need just enough load, right? Some sort of counterweight, some sort of external support to be able to execute their motor control in a great efficient manner. So at that next block, that 3rd week, I'm just trying to hammer home capacity and I'm trying to hammer home good movement quality. Then from there, I just follow the velocity, the force velocity curve is where I go from really weeks 13 all the way up till they return to play. I'm just progressing based off, okay, now I want to chase maximal force output, absolute strength. Okay, I have my standards of, I love to see 1.5x body weight in a bilateral squat, 0.4 to 0.5 meters per second. Then I'm just dosing that on the velocity side to gain speed as I continue to demonstrate requisite strength. The other thing that I'd failed to mention throughout this whole process is from a local loading perspective, there are metrics that we want to hit from a quadricep and hamstring strength perspective if you have access to isokinetic data, isokinetic testing. For those that are unfamiliar with an isokinetic machine, it looks like this big crazy chair. You strap in a leg and all the goal is you're kicking into this immovable object for an isometric test, where the isokinetic test is you're kicking into it. It's somewhat movable, but it moves at a constant rate. And so what the machine is doing is just measuring the force output as you push through full range. And what we've learned in the literature is the speed at 60 degrees per second. So it's slow, but it's not fast. Like it's a good constant rate. It's what we've learned. The equivalent is like a 5 rep maximum attempt. And so what we've learned here is the gold standard for what that should be from an output perspective of quadriceps is 100% body weight of peak torque. Then you're looking from a hamstring to quad ratio. Literature will say 65%. My humble opinion, I think that's too low. I like to shoot for 75, 80%. So what that means is, let's for easy math, you're a 200-pound athlete. Your peak torque your peak torque on the isokinetic needs to be 200 pounds. Your hamstring, 70, let's just say 75% for easy math, has to be 150. If you're not hitting those outputs, I don't care what your asymmetry is, because asymmetry doesn't matter until maximum output is achieved. Then once maximal output is achieved, then asymmetry matters, right? That's where, when we talk about the triple hop and the cluster of hop testing, right? The intention was well as far as return to play criteria, but what we learned was the contralateral limb actually got weaker as the affected side got stronger. So yes, the output was good, but overall both outputs were down in comparison to pre-injury baseline. So this entire process throughout, I am monitoring isokinetic testing. If not isokinetic testing, I just had a conversation with this the other day. A simple way you could do that is if you have access to a knee extension machine, on the unaffected side, have them do a 5 rep maximum.
Yep.
Then do the same exact thing, and then not do the same exact, don't do a max test at 6 weeks, but then dose, okay, here, we're going to do 50% of what you did on the other side. And then you just start loading it with weight. And like, you don't need fancy equipment for progressive overload, because that's what it is. And then you can create your litmus test of, all right, we're week 12, week 16, week 20. We kind of want to see what maximal outputs are. What can they do on that leg extension machine? And then it's relative. And then the machine's always the same. You have your internal test. You can let the training be the test and the test be the training. And so that entire process right there, you don't need a fancy $80,000 isokinetic machine, although they're amazing. You don't necessarily need them. The one thing I'll say from relative to an S&C, just to keep this going, relative to earlier part of the conversation around return to training, there's certain like the gray space of rehab is we don't have good metrics of what someone should be cleared to do next in training. We know what the metrics are to be able to return to play and return to sport. Like that's always where the research is done.
Yep.
Very poor research and very limited information out there on, hey, when should I start introducing extensive plyos? When should I start introducing, Adam, you talked about force velocity profile. Well, when do you transfer from absolute strength to speed, strength to strength, speed to maximal velocity? Like, what are your metrics there?
Right.
So sticking with an isokinetic perspective, and I'm going to use running because we always like to get back to running or ground contacts as fast as possible. I don't do anything until we achieve, one, a relatively quiet knee clinically, but then two, from an isokinetic or an open chain exercise, you have to be at 70% of your body weight from an output perspective. And then from 70% is just where I say, okay, cool, we can start doing rhythmic plyometrics or your aerobic plyometrics, extensive plyometrics, whichever phrase you want to use. Yep. And then you're running re-ed drills, right? So your wall skips, your wall drills, your A skips, all those things. And as I get to 80% of quadricep strength relative to peak torque value, then I'll introduce, okay, now we can start doing some light jogging. And then once we get up to 90%, then I feel fairly confident that we have the requisite strength to tolerate the loads that are going to go through. And I don't believe that you need to subscribe to having those maximal outputs on isokinetic testing, because you also have to recognize the body's going to continue to get stronger as you expose them to whole task strategies as well. So It's important to say, like, you don't have to have this hard line of saying, no, we can't do any impact until we get 100%. It's like, no, like that's going to come with time too. And the exposure with those activities will do it as well.
Yeah. Really wanted a HUMAC until I did some price shopping and realized the price tag is a little bit out of my price range, at least as a small private gym owner, but damn, they are sweet.
They're very informative. They really dial in the training process. You can really get really creative beyond just, what I talked about as far as peak torque values. You can get into rate, you can get into eccentric qualities. I do believe that, like we talked about in fitness, we're just like on this 40-year cycle where things kind of come back around. Like isokinetics for the last 5 years have blown up again. Why? Because we realize the value of beyond just functional movements. Like, we can't forget about the parts and the local qualities.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. I do want to talk about one more area if you've got time and are keen to it, because I know we have both shared time in the soccer space as well. And as bad as an ACL is, right, in soccer or basketball, one of the worst things you can have in soccer is a hamstring strain. And so I do feel like also there's still a lot of mythology around rehabbing a hamstring.
Mhm.
I'm not sure why that is, but it doesn't seem like there's nearly the same level of support behind rehabbing a hamstring as there is an ACL. So I would love if you have a few moments, just kind of walk us through that process as well,
Yeah.
because it's a big one, right? What is it, like probably minimum 8 weeks if you're having a hamstring pull, and that's a big chunk of your season if you got to miss 8 weeks.
Yeah. I would say, just full disclosure, we didn't see many hamstring strains in the basketball space. That
Yeah.
being said, I've always started in soccer. I've always just had like you have your injuries that just like fascinate you.
Yes.
Hamstring has always been one of them for me.
I know. Me too. Me too. I think it's the soccer thing, because if you do see them in soccer, you're like, okay, I don't want any more of these.
Yeah, they're not easy. They're complicated. As far as the methodology around the rehab, I think we're still learning what really is the stress that the hamstring is responsible for during sprinting. We've gotten a lot better at it. I know one of the debates that hopefully is slowly starting to dwindle, but it was like, was it an isometric contraction? Is it a yielding isometric, or is it an eccentric action during terminal leg swing, right? Like whether you the Franz Bosch method or you the classical mechanical model where, no, that's an eccentric action, but you look at the studies, it's like, no, like the muscle length doesn't change. Actually, the tendon's lengthening. So why is it that, why are we focusing on eccentric strength when we should be focusing on yielding isometrics, right? So I feel like we've gotten better at that, but to come back to like how my perspective is on the soft tissue side, you got to go slow with soft tissue. And the reason I say that is if you have a re-injury in soft tissue, mentally that messes with the athlete so bad.
Yes.
And they're just ones that you can't rush. Like, and that's where like you got to, having an understanding and appreciation for the healing timelines is even more critical and relevant when you start talking about muscle injuries. And then there's some good literature that's out there when you talk about whether it's the location of the muscle injury. Is it mid-belly? Is it MTJ? Is it at the tendon? Is it biceps femoris versus semitendinosus versus membranosus? Like, it's been hamstring injury type has been, I feel, researched ad nauseum. But to your point, the rehab side of it is still up in the air. And from my perspective, now please, if listeners are there and they're working in soccer and they know something that I don't know, please share with me. But my understanding of how I would go about it is similar in the sense that hamstring strain, get rid of tenderness to palpation, restore range of motion. If it was a bad one, get rid of swelling intramuscularly, and then your muscle needs load. You're trying to introduce it as soon as possible with a pain-free range, right? With muscle injuries, the rule of thumb that I have, if it's less than a 3 out of 10 pain relative to the athlete, it's safe to do. The moment it crosses that 3 to 10 barrier, back off. Pain is body's danger signal of telling us that's too much. Now, there's a difference between soreness and discomfort. Those are necessary to make adaptation, but we can't discourage pain. So first and foremost, that's probably your biggest key indicator your first 4 weeks. Then the gray space becomes, well, they're not having symptoms. Clinically, they've got range of motion. All right, what am I focusing on as far as the rehab side? So breaking it down from a local tissue quality, I want to focus on both knee flexion and hip extension, preferably working them in isolation first before I start trying to do them in dynamic exercises. So what that might look like is I'm going to do leg curls. I'm going to do hamstring slides, like do that stuff till the cows come home until they don't demonstrate an asymmetry. And you can progress that both with concentric, eccentrics, and isometrics. All of them are valuable and have their place. And I think there's no subscription to any particular theory that I have, because ultimately the muscle is going to behave in multiple ways. So hit them all, right? Like do Nordics, do razor curls, do open chain, do the heel slides. All of them are going to stress the muscle in a different way because it's a 2-joint muscle when you look at the majority of the hamstrings, with the exception of the short head of the biceps femoris. So I'm, from a movement side and the local loading, I'm hitting all of that. And then when it comes to the locomotion side of things, this is where I think the work of Derek Hansen and folks like him, sprint coaches, have done a great job educating. They see hamstring strains all the time, right? And so you think about it, the way the principle that I have when it comes to rehabbing muscle injuries is isometric first, because the muscle isn't changing length. Then concentric force, because you can still control the range through partial. And then it's eccentric. Well, relative to a hamstring, acceleration mechanics you can do pretty early on in a hamstring rehab. Like doing a sled push, you'd be surprised how quickly an athlete can do a sled push and not feel all that much discomfort. Why? It's slow. It's long ground contact times, and it's force production. Hamstrings, yes, they produce force, but in my opinion, they produce them most oftenly at higher velocities. And if you subscribe to the Franz Bosch model, then they're doing it isometrically. So a concentric activity like a sled push isn't going to bother them, but it's also going to work on running mechanics. It's also going to work on being able to cue appropriate shin angles as they're running. You'll be able to work on hip extension. You're going to work on knee extension, right? All ththese things that are important for running and straighter hip running and sprinting that are necessary for hamstring rehab, you can do them so early on by grooving the pattern, right? So the big variable I would manipulate during the entire hamstring process would be the length of ground contact times. Like, just let that be your KPI, right? So the longest ground contact time is going to be an isometric. Then from there, it's going to be something dynamic with a heavy resistance. If you think about the force velocity curve, if I'm producing more force, I can't go fast, and I'm going to have a long ground contact time. And then I drop off the load, and I increase velocity, increase speed of movement, make it more reflexive, less conscious, more subconscious, and now you're getting to that space of sport. So you can manipulate that variable from a hamstring injury rehab the entire process. Over the course of 8 weeks, I would just break it up in 2-week chunks, right? I would go isometric and concentric as soon as pain isn't an issue. Then I'd really work on more kind of that speed strength zone, and then I'd work on more of the higher velocities as they can tolerate it, while the entire time I'm just addressing the local strength qualities throughout. Is that helpful?
That's super helpful. Super helpful. Okay. And again, I just want, if you're an S&C coach listening to this, I want to give you perspective on the medical side, on the PT side, so that you understand what they're up against when an athlete does get injured and what they're thinking about, kind of putting yourself in their shoes early on so that you understand the process. And when they do pass the baton to you, you kind of know where they're coming from and you know the next steps to take. So, dude, this was fantastic. Now, I've got a lightning round. I got 5 questions for you today. Okay, are you ready for this?
I hope so.
And I'm just going to start doing this now. I'm not giving anybody else the questions to the lightning round because I want authentic answers. Okay.
I don't think I've ever gotten the questions lightning round, so I will.
Okay.
I think we've been
keep you on your toes.
We're honest over here.
Okay. No, I respect that. Okay. Number 1, best and worst part of living in Phoenix, or is it technically Scottsdale?
Scottsdale, and best part, the weather. The worst part, the weather.
Well played. Okay, I like it. Number 2, I know you're always educating yourself. Have you read any good books lately? Or anything that captured you? No?
No, it's been all reading up on business and more the entrepreneur side of things. So really just taking snippets here and there. Honestly, my reading has come into more fiction lately, just as a way to shut my mind off.
Yeah. No, I get that.
There's a bunch of true crime novels and murder mysteries.
Oh, dude. The problem with me, I love those kind of books and it shuts my brain off, but then I want to keep reading.
Yeah, I get that.
Right?
I get that.
Like, that's the downside. Like, my wife, she'll read till like 2 a.m. sometimes. I'm like, aren't you tired? But she's reading stuff that's more engaging than, like calf profiling, or whatever I'm reading at that point in time. So no, I get it. Man, number 3, go ahead.
I'll say you said books, but I would also say I've been heavy into evaluating normative data across a lot of technologies, because we're in a space now in sports tech and data that a lot of people have access to this now, and these companies are starting to aggregate data and are starting to pump out research on this. So I'm looking at it as, okay, we have a large enough data sample set, in my opinion, that we can start considering these things as far as what are the standards we want on force plates, what are the standards we want on other technology like a NordBoard or force frame, right? So me trying to learn from the available evidence that's out there, and then how do I implement that research into practice? Because the number one thing any athlete or client wants to know after they do a test is, was that good or not? Yeah. And then the classic answer a therapist or strength coach will say, well, it depends, and we're just going to compare against your baseline. Respectfully, bullshit. Like,
right. Yeah.
there should be a standard that we all hold ourselves accountable to. And I think we use that answer of it depends, or we're going to compare against yourself, is because we haven't had the opportunity to test at a large scale. And now you're seeing that with force plates almost in every clinic and every sports team. People using, depending on your sport, they have muscle specific strength testing, and you're starting to see aggregation of data there. So to your long-winded answer, I know it was a lightning round, but I've been deep into the normative data literature.
No, we need to talk more about that, because I would love to hear more. Maybe not now, but no, I'm fascinated by this, because as more of this has come out, right, the great thing for me is if you don't have tech in your space, a lot of times you're limited to, depending on who you're working with, you're limited to your own data set, right? Mm-hmm. So, hey man, I might have the best data, but if I'm collecting on 15 people, it's not the strongest data set. Versus now, like you said, there's normative data out there, so a kid that I'm working with, he's committed to play Division I basketball. Well, now there's all this normative data where I can go and I can pull it all in, and I can show him, hey, compared to 100 Division I basketball players, here are your metrics, right? And you do these things really, really well, but these are things that if we just want to get you to an average or above average level, there's physical qualities we need to work on. So I think not just as an explanation of them, but as a driver of program design, that stuff could be incredibly valuable.
My vision is that, my vision is to put a performance therapist in everybody's pocket. And you do that by having a consistent testing process and then just evaluating their scores against the normative data.
Yep.
Like there's we'll wrap this up here on this question.
Yeah.
You can go in, and there's studies that look at this from DEXA scans, population norms, if you're 35 years old and a male and you get your DEXA report, how do you compare percentile to people of your age? That data's out there.
Yeah.
You want to look at VO2 max, man or female or male. You can look at every decade of life, and then the paper that most people reference breaks it down into 5 different categories. So aiming for the elite category of your age group should be the standard for something like VO2 max. So those principles of large sample size, normative data, yes, I can. If you're a strength and conditioning coach and you work in professional sports, you're probably saying, yeah, Adam, but that stuff's based on, population age 20 to 80. None of them are professional athletes. They're just active adults. Yes. And what are you going to hang your hat on to say when an athlete gets a test, what's good or what's not? When the coach comes to you and says, hey, are they fit or not? Hey, do we need to run a fitness test during preseason this year? Hey, that athlete looks weak. He doesn't. Comparing against themselves isn't a litmus test. Comparing them against population norms is a good starting point. And then, yes, fine tune based on your population. But I promise you, the normative data is going to be super powerful in these next 5 years.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to chat more about that. Okay. Number 3. You got to have a little bit more free time now, right? What are you doing with all of this? I'll put it in air quotes, free time.
Just catching up on my community. My wife and I, we were almost going to move away from Scottsdale and get back to Atlanta. And part of that was man, we just don't feel like we have a community out here in Scottsdale. And then once I was no longer traveling every other night and was home for dinners, and we could participate in social events on weekends, and we realized wow, we do have a community out here. We just haven't been able to invest time into that. So really just been embracing the social life that I haven't had for the last several years of my life. And then also, I'm a new dad, man. I got a 1-year-old. So dad life is consuming a lot of my other free time.
I love it, man. But that's a fun age. That's fun for sure. Okay. Number 4, the podcast. How is it going, man? I'm listening to the one on, what is it? At the orthobiologics. I don't remember the name. It just sounded really fancy, and I'm interested in that. So is it going well?
Yeah, the podcast is going well, man. It's a great opportunity to share experiences that I've had in professional sports, because the reality is a lot of people want to know what that environment's like.
Sure.
And so guests that come on the podcast all have some exposure experience working in professional sports, and we try to, with respect to boundaries and sporting organizations, we just try to pull back the curtain and say people in sports are viewed as the elite of the elite. Now, that may be true for some, but it's not true for all. So the goal is just trying to make sure we're educating ourselves, and also just saying, hey, in the private space, you may be doing more than what they're doing in the team setting. And I promise you, there's a lot of places that are like that, because there's a lot of politics and boundaries and integration that happens or doesn't happen in team sports that sometimes makes it difficult to get things done. So when you're, if you're a small business owner who's a strength and conditioning coach or a personal trainer that's running your own business, like, also give yourself some credit and say, like, there are things that you're doing that some pro sports teams wish they could do because you don't have constraints that they have.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, last but not least, number 5. What's next for Adam Loiacono? What are you working on? What are you excited about? Anything?
Yeah, I'm really excited. Right now, we're in week 1. I just launched a performance therapy mentorship. So a lot of the questions we were talking about today, like how do we bridge that medical model to the performance model? How do you manage that gray space? And because strength and conditioning coaches want to help their athletes more, like you talked about, and then you have the performance physical therapist that, hey, like I don't understand the performance space as much, or I want to integrate it more. So in the middle of the performance therapy mentorship, the way that's structured is it's an intensive 3-month curriculum every week. You're probably committing anywhere from 5 to 10 hours of your time, all this content that put together. And then on top of that, you get a bunch of supplemental material that you have access to for another 9 months. So all in, you get access to the material for 12 months, which is fantastic. I think it's a great resource, obviously bias here.
Yes.
But that is just the working of, we talk about, a mutual friend of ours, Bill Hartman, how he has his own model. And so over the last several years, been writing down mine and my systems and process and frameworks and put it in a coherent space for people to learn to get better as a performance therapist. So that's really exciting. There'll be another cohort launching in early next year. So we can definitely send some listeners over there if they want to learn more. And then from a cycle perspective, man, it's just, there's projects that are going on, from exploring the concierge medicine space to digital fitness space to getting my feet wet back into the soccer space and running some off-season training out here. So the entrepreneur life is treating me well, and I am just embracing the opportunity to build new relationships, rekindle old ones, and just try and set the standard for performance therapy.
I love it, man. Well, Adam, it's been so great catching up with you. I appreciate your time. We went a little bit long, but man, all great stuff. Where can my listeners find out more about you and all the great work that you're doing?
The most active on Instagram. It's just the one I'm choosing to focus on. So Instagram would be first one, adam.loiacono. Then the website, adamloiacono.com, there's a lot of free resources on there that houses articles, that houses resources for downloads relative to some of the topics we talked about today, and then some. Yeah. Also, the podcast and exclusive content for the podcast lives there. So those are the two main resources. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can on the website. There's a link to work with me and get in touch, or vice versa. You can always slide into the DMs on Instagram.
Yes, I will just leave on this note. There's some really great articles on your website. I know you've linked to a couple of them, but there was a time where I went through and basically I was reading 2 or 3 of those a week because they're really well written. I'm of an age where I still appreciate a well-written article. I don't think everything can be digested into a 1-minute reel on IG. So some really great stuff there. And if you enjoyed the show today, I'll make sure in the show notes to link to Adam's IG and his website. Be sure to check that out. And again, Adam, thanks so much, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Always, Mike. Nice to always chop it up with you, man.